I think many of you in this room have been professionals within the Jewish community, are professionals in the Jewish community, work very closely with professionals in the Jewish community. So you may be the very lucky person who has always had a smooth ride with volunteers. You may be the lucky person who always has a strong volunteer who's by your side to lift you up. But for some of us, we know that when you find a volunteer who is committed and passionate to lifting you up, you hold on to that person very tightly. So I jumped at the chance to just spend a minute up here to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Ed Shapiro. So Ed is the kind of volunteer and leader who doesn't just make you a better professional, but in my case has indescribably made me a better person. Pushes me personally to think about things in new ways, but specifically not to settle. Not to settle for what matters to me as a human and marrying that to me with what matters as a community. And that's not always easy. It's very hard sometimes to synthesize what's happening in this world, what you make of it, and what your role is within your organization. And then Ed takes those passions and drives and says, if this is what you care about personally, if this is what the organization cares about, what can we do as a community? Because this is redundant. Over and over again, we care about things. Over and over again, I'm having the same conversations. How come we're not all in a room together? And by the way, it's not just about you as a person. And by the way, it's not just about your one organization. This is about the impact that we seek to have. Ed has been a trustee for his family foundation, the Shapiro Foundation, and you can read his full bio in your handbook. For 20 years, he was the managing partner at Par Capital. He's obviously been involved in many complicated collaborations, mergers, and acquisitions. What you'll hear today is that Ed is going to inspire us and really push us to lead with our heart and marry that with our head. That there are inefficiencies, there are redundancies, but there are so many opportunities, and so many of us have these shared passions. Ed travels around the world as part of his duties with his family foundation. His passion is refugees. He thinks about what will it take to make this world a place that is better for this one person. What is it going to mean for my children, one of whom is here, Josh, this morning? What is it going to mean for them to live in a world that embodies the values that I'm trying to teach them, that he sent his children to Rashi for? The idea that this community, the Jewish community, has a key role to play in lifting up all of us, but that we need to be in it together because we're not doing a good enough job on our own. So I want to personally thank you for pushing us in the way that you do, for leading in the way that you do, for thinking about us as people, but as bringing the people together to have a much bigger impact than we would on our own. Thank you for being here.
I want to thank CJP for bringing this community together so that whatever the topic might be, I could talk about the Patriots, or at least I thought I might a week ago. It's a good excuse to get everybody together. And one of the premises that I've shared with Mark and Sarah, my perspective is that there is this untapped opportunity to bring this community together. And CJP, I believe, sits in a perfect position to do that, to be the common bond, whatever the topic may be, and there are many of them. So when Sarah asked me to speak about consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, she posed the question, do airlines have anything to teach the Jewish community? And I thought about that. It sounded like a good sequel to, some of you know, Barry Schrade's favorite book is John Lennon and the Jews. Seems like a similar, not obvious question. But the fact is, I'll go into my background in a minute, but I have these two worlds, these two careers, I'll call them. I spent 27 years in Boston in the investment business, and then I took that knowledge and I moved full-time 3 years ago with my colleague Larry Tobin, who's here somewhere. Many of you know from his years at CJP. Still, I don't think safe for me to walk the halls of CJP, and I get these dirty looks from stealing Larry away and all the incredible work he was doing for CJP in the community. But he and I, for the last 3 years now, have been, as Sarah said, traveled the world, working on refugee causes and really taking the very narrow skills that I had in airline investing, principally, and applying that to philanthropy and to a particular focus on refugees. I didn't believe or necessarily think that those skills were transferable, and every day I get surprised positively by taking those skills and taking a mentality of really driving collaboration. There's only so much that Larry and I can do ourselves, and so finding incredible partners in Boston, around the country, around the continent, and around the world, and having trust in them, learning from them, and collaborating. In some cases, very actively and being a strategic partner. In other cases, just more passively, learning what they do, understanding the value that these organizations are bringing, where there are gaps, in our case in refugee resettlement and refugee support, and supporting them financially. So what I want to talk about, what Sarah and Mark asked me to talk about, is my experience in my private sector world. I said where I spent 27 years. I was also on a number of boards. I was on 5 public company boards and 6 private company boards, in addition to my 10 years on, I guess, 6 nonprofit boards, including CJP, Boston Children's Hospital, where I spent 14 years on the board there and chaired the finance committee, the Rashi School, where I was on for 6 or 7 years. So I have some knowledge, but honestly, my experience on the M&A side, really consolidation, comes from my investing experience, and using those and pulling those lessons and trying to find areas where I thought they would be relevant, and maybe still are relevant in the nonprofit sector. So talk a little bit about my background. I grew up in LA. I moved to Boston in 1990. My personal vow was that I would be here for 2 years, and here I am on my 30th winter. So some things I maybe had a good sense of, and I thought I could live anywhere for a couple of years, but the reality is, for a number of reasons, this is an incredible community, and I didn't expect, as a Laker fan, to be able to survive in Boston for very long. But it was easy to become a Red Sox and Patriots fan, particularly Red Sox. You move here from LA, and first thing people say is, "Oh, we hate the Yankees even more than the Dodger fans do." But through my time here, personally and professionally, in the last 6 or 7 years, through the Jewish community, the Rashi School being my introduction really to this world, and then through CJP, I have come to appreciate what how special this community is. And we all think that maybe about our own community, but there have been a number of our partners, both nationally and internationally, that have all talked about the uniqueness of this community and the opportunities for collaboration. And that's what I've tried to do, is try to find those opportunities to use some of the benefits that I think come from consolidation and collaboration, and find opportunities across the organizations that I'm directly involved with and indirectly to see where we might be able to drive more efficiencies. So I want to talk a little bit about mergers and acquisitions. Some of you may know some about this and others not. Well, just at a basic level, the question is whether a combination of 2 organizations can create more value for its stakeholders than staying independent. And stakeholders encompass multiple, in the private sector sense, it's shareholders, it's employees, it's customers, it's suppliers, and communities. Boards of directors have a legal fiduciary obligation to maximize value for their shareholders, but increasingly there is a recognition that you can't do that in isolation. All of the stakeholders are important. And you have to balance in the private sector the efficiencies that might be gained from collaboration and consolidation with antitrust laws. There are many potential mergers you could look at that would be incredibly valuable, but the government has a legal obligation to protect the consumers. And so that is often a very significant consideration that is not as relevant in the nonprofit sector, but it's something you spend a lot of time with in boardrooms and thinking about not only the benefits of a merger, but whether in fact it would be legally permitted. So broadly speaking, there are 3 types of mergers. There's called horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, and one that I call conglomerates. So a horizontal merger, think of a combination of 2 companies competing in essentially the same business. Sprint, T-Mobile, as a recent example, or United Airlines and Continental Airlines in my world. Those kind of mergers typically receive the most scrutiny from the Justice Department. A vertical merger is one that is typically between a supplier and a distributor. Think Comcast buying NBC, or Disney Pixar, or recently AT&T Time Warner. A conglomerate is a collection of very different businesses by a common owner. Think of Berkshire Hathaway buying NetJets or Burlington Northern Railroad. So why merge? Mergers involve change, and change is hard. It can also be expensive and lead to all kinds of uncertainty. So there has to be a motivation to do that. At one extreme, mergers can happen as a result of desperation. A company that is either bankrupt or near bankrupt and recognizes, based on forces in that industry, in that company, that if they don't merge, they're going to cease to exist. And that was actually my original experience. I was part of a consortium in 1995 that put together a merger between America West Airlines and US Airways. It ended up being the first of 5 mergers that consolidated the industry over the next 10 years. And that was really a situation. Old US Airways, that you may remember on the East Coast, was in bankruptcy. It was in bankruptcy a second time, and it was not clear at all that they could survive. America West Airlines wasn't technically in bankruptcy, but there was a lot of turmoil in the airline industry post-2001, and they were probably realistically on the cusp of bankruptcy. And so there was this idea that 2 drunken soldiers propping each other up. If they didn't do something, certainly US Airways and potentially America West might cease to exist. That's a very strong motivation, as you can imagine, to overcome a lot of risk and uncertainty if you don't think you're going to survive without a merger. We actually, a little inside baseball, mergers have code names because they're very sensitive before they come public, and we called it Barbell because we had these 2, the West Coast network in America West and the East Coast network in US Airways. When that was leaked, someone in the press, I think, said, maybe we should call it Dumbbell. But from a buyer perspective, sometimes it's opportunistic. There's a company that is struggling, it can be purchased maybe for pennies on the dollar, whether it's a product or a market that they want to enter. It can be a very interesting opportunity, especially if there's not necessarily competition for it. So that has been a number of very successful mergers. But the typical underlying motivation is shareholder value. Boards of directors are tasked by their shareholders, elected by their shareholders, to maximize shareholder value. And oftentimes there is a belief, sometimes accurately and sometimes not, that merging, consolidating an industry will add more value to their shareholders. Sometimes boards are pushed to do that. There are, as we speak, a number of active, high-profile hostile offers where one company is seeking to push another company's board to consider a merger or an acquisition, that they believe that it's in the interests of their shareholders. The target company may or may not agree. It may be just plain coy to try to get a better deal. They may try to get another merger partner that they feel more comfortable with. But at the end of the day, the public company structure leads to the possible pressure for activist shareholders, board members, to push for consolidation. The management teams may not want to do it, they may not be comfortable, but they're a process to get pushed if there really is value to be had. There's also a question of timing. Why now? Maybe a merger makes sense, but what drives a company to consider it at a given time? And I would say, typically, there's some change, whether it's leadership change, a CEO retiring, political change. There may be deemed to be a more friendly antitrust administration, and when an election is upcoming, that may drive companies to either accelerate their timing or wait till a change. There's also a typical situation, sort of business 101, that when a market slows, when markets are growing and you're adding, your company's growing, your earnings are growing, there's less pressure. But when business slows, when an industry matures, and that was the case in the airline industry, it hadn't been growing for years, and there was basically too many carriers competing for the same number and even shrinking number of passengers, that often drives industries and companies to consider mergers. There's also the question of hostile versus friendly that I touched on. Oftentimes, 2 companies, 2 management teams may have a history, know each other, are very well aligned. That's probably the minority of cases. But whether there's a public pressure, a hostile offer announced, there's also a term called a bear hug, where they will basically say, we're friendly, we're here to help you, give you a big hug, but recognize if you don't submit, there may be consequences. There's also the question of consideration. Often, depending on the size and the circumstances of the merger, is one company issuing stock, issuing shares to the acquisition target, allowing their shareholders to participate in the upside from a combination versus the certainty of cash. I don't know whether I don't agree with this merger, but if you pay me enough money, then you can get convinced that this is a better outcome. Let the acquiring company shareholders take the risk and pay me cash. And those are often tensions, and there's not necessarily agreement. Some shareholders say, I like this, I agree, I want to participate, give me stock, and others are saying, write me a check. So that's a consideration that often is a big deal, and sometimes may not be the optimal outcome, but depending on the size, you have no choice but to take stock, and that is a consideration for both sides. Then there's what are called social issues. Sometimes those can be very significant and sometimes not. Things like who's going to be the CEO of the combined company, what does the board look like, who gets to stay on the new company's board and who has to leave, what's the name of the company. In the airline industry, it's been somewhat atypical where it's not necessarily the acquirer whose brand persists. When we did America West and US Airways, it was America West buying old US Airways out of bankruptcy, but took the US Airways name, left the management and the headquarters in Phoenix, but took the US Airways name because it had a better brand, a larger company. And then later, when US Airways merged with American Airlines, same thing. It took the American Airlines name, but it was really US Airways, really America West. That management team, that company, and those original shareholders that were the buyer. But in that case, they moved to Dallas. They took the American headquarters. That was a big deal. That was a big deal for the management teams, the boards, and the communities. Not necessarily relevant to the merits of the merger up front, but really important issues, and particularly when it involves local governments who care a lot. Dallas cared a lot about maintaining American Airlines as their headquarters. Then there's the idea of cost synergies versus revenue synergies. And there isn't necessarily a fine line, but you can imagine that some of the analysis in any potential merger is, what are the costs that we know we take out? One CEO, one CFO, one headquarters typically. Those are the easier costs to analyze, or easier benefits. The revenue is harder. What am I going to do? Whether it's a vertical or horizontal merger, how am I benefiting my shareholders? What market share, what lower costs am I getting from doing this? And it's not, I don't want to discount, egos matter a lot, and people can talk themselves into, and advisors are really good at talking management teams into mergers that they benefit from. It's not always the case that those apparent synergies are realized, but they can be real. And again, sometimes negotiated with the government in terms of antitrust considerations. Big deal in airlines about what opportunities when you merge two airlines, particularly large ones like Delta and Northwest and United and Continental, American US Airways, what routes, what airports are restricted and deemed to have too high a market share, not necessarily nationally, but in a local market, that's what's relevant. We in Boston don't necessarily care what the market share is in LA to San Francisco, but we care about it in Boston, and so the Justice Department looks very carefully at that. Then there's the upfront costs that typically all mergers have. There are some expenses, sometimes very significant. In the case of airline mergers, it can be billions of dollars, from basic things like repainting all the planes. Those are expensive, cost $100,000 or more to paint each plane. And you're going to have to spend that money to change your branding, at least over time. There are systems, in some cases, that have to be replaced. That's also a big deal in airline reservation systems that have to be merged. You have to spend a lot of money migrating from one to another, and there's opportunities, there's risks of upsetting your customers in that process. And so you need to be very mindful of what those are and weigh them really against the ongoing benefits. And then there's culture. Culture is a very difficult one to quantify, but relevant across the nonprofit sector as well, obviously. What do these organizations, they have a history, a culture that's not always easy. Again, airlines, that can be very difficult. You have the additional element that's somewhat unique in the airline industry around unions. Which union is going to represent the flight attendants, the pilots? These are competition, these are paid jobs, they're dues, there's a lot at stake. And then there's seniority, which turned out to be the biggest deal. Just just last year, United and Continental, 8 years after their merger, finally what's called merged their seniority list. So if you're a Continental flight attendant and a United flight attendant, you've had separate planes that you could only fly on, the old Continental planes and the old United planes. It took 8 years to be able to work with the unions and overcome these issues. And it's a big, big emotional deal. As you can imagine, you're a senior Continental Airlines flight attendant in Newark that gets to pick your flights to Europe, and all of a sudden you merge with United and you're more junior, and now all of a sudden you have to fly Newark-Boston 3 times a day. So those are big emotional deals, but they're real. And depending on the particular merger, it's something that definitely have to take into account. So I just want to talk a minute about nonprofits. When I told my family that I was asked to speak about M&A in the nonprofit sector, I think it was Josh, my son, who said, "What do you know about that?" It's a good point. It's never stopped me before. But I do think, and again, having some experience on the boards of several Boston nonprofits, I do think there are some interesting parallels. At its core, there's a responsibility to your stakeholders. And while the balance of your stakeholders, there aren't shareholders, but there are donors, and there are certainly employees and communities and partners that you have to take into account. And the question that I always push organizations to think about is, are you better able to serve your stakeholders? Would you be better able to serve in combination, whether it's a legal combination and a full merger at one extreme, or simply collaboration? It was, I guess I would say, frustrating to me to come to appreciate there wasn't as much collaboration among organizations. Locally, globally, organizations have expertise. In some cases, very significant, either local or content expertise that would benefit. And I see it all the time. Larry and I are pushing our partners all the time. We identify with our knowledge of the refugee space opportunities and really try to drive collaboration. And it is I think, a significant untapped opportunity in this community, as we talked about. I think CJP, you said, is in a great position to bring you all here together, if nothing else, to get to know each other. I think a lot of it is just simply organizations, management teams, understandably, and boards focused on their individual missions without knowing that there's other organizations in the community or outside the community that have similar business models, similar incentives and objectives that would benefit from simply learning more about each other. There's been a number, even just in the last couple of years, Mark's tenure, have been a number of opportunities, work with my friend Charlie Glassenberg, who I see there, to find other federations. Let's just share. Let's find efficient ways to communicate what we're all doing and benefit from each other's. And a number of the projects that Larry and I are working on are from just uncovering over the last few years what these organizations are doing and how we can benefit. In some cases, we can help be the catalyst to drive collaboration, but in other cases, people are coming to us and saying, we know you have a relationship with another organization, how can we help drive those introductions? There will be cases, I imagine, in this world it's going to be the exception, where organizations will say, in order to really get the benefits, we need to legally merge. We need to bring these two organizations together. I think there will be opportunities to do that selectively, but it's not all or nothing. In the private sector, it's actually much harder. There are partnerships, but it's very difficult when you have two different sets of shareholders that you're responsible for, and you need to spend a lot of time and effort. What percentage of this deal is each of our shareholders? Lots of times with lawyers and agreements who have to be very focused on protecting their own shareholders. We don't have that in this world, largely. We have common beneficiaries. We're all doing this because we think we can impact the world. And the idea is that working together, we can do a lot more than working independently. I don't want to be naive about it. I've recognized there are natural barriers, ultimately maybe most significantly around donors and competition for donors. So I think there's a role here that donors have to play, and CJP as a donor, as a partner, I think can be and should be and is a critical, important partner for that. These are not independent, competitive, I'm going to fund you and not you. We want the best outcome possible. And so there's an opportunity that I'm really excited to help Mark and Sarah drive here to think through where those opportunities exist and how we might be able to, how CJP might be able to help all of you be more effective. And that ranges from growth and expansion outside of Boston, it's a Boston focus, or inside Boston, expanding and improving the work that we're all doing. The only other thing I want to mention is the defensive nature. I think companies, and maybe to some extent nonprofits, can look at a situation and say, for whatever reason, conclude, we're not going to merge, we're not going to collaborate. The question I think you have to ask yourself, and we certainly do as boards, is, okay, if we don't do this, what's going to happen? Is a competitor going to merge and put us in an even more vulnerable position? It's a little bit of game theory. We spent a lot of time, I did, when I was on the US Airways board. They said it was the beginning of what ended up being the first of 5 mergers. A lot of game theory at our board meetings. If United merges with Continental, what does that mean for Delta? What does that mean for Northwest? What does Southwest do? What are the low-cost carriers? And so some cases that may be relevant, and some cases not. But I would just encourage you all to think about another step ahead. This may or may not be the easiest thing to do today, but look out a few years. What if we don't? What happens to that organization? What happens to our own organization? What do our competitors, if there are competitors, or do irrelevant? What happens if you don't do anything? It's important, and it's educated guesses, obviously. The environment changes, the economy changes, politics, we know, locally and nationally change, but give thought to looking at different scenarios of what if you do something and what if you don't, and what are the options. And I guess the other thing I would say, I'll just reiterate again, the cost side sometimes is the biggest driver and it's the easiest, but revenue and thinking through from a business model perspective, what are those opportunities through consolidation and collaboration than if I don't do this? Are there more markets? Can I serve more beneficiaries, and can I do it more effectively through a combination or collaboration with a partner than I can otherwise?